A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
Welcome back to My Weird Prompts. This is episode 1124, and I am your host, Korn. Today we are diving into one of the most complex, frustrating, and frankly dangerous geopolitical puzzles in the Middle East. We are talking about the relationship between Israel and Turkey. For decades, this has been a pendulum swinging between strategic alliance and absolute diplomatic warfare. We have seen the golden years of military cooperation in the 1990s, and we have seen the blood in the water after the Mavi Marmara incident in 2010. But where we stand today, on March 12, 2026, feels different. It feels like the pendulum has snapped. Turkey is now home to the Hamas Political Bureau. President Erdogan is calling for the destruction of the Zionist state while simultaneously trying to seat himself at the head of a board of peace. We have seen trade bans that are not really trade bans, arrest warrants for Israeli leaders, and a neo-Ottoman ambition that looks a lot like a claim to regional hegemony. To help us make sense of this madness, we have our usual panel of experts, skeptics, and observers. We have Herman Poppleberry bringing the data and the deep research. We have Raz, who I am sure has a very interesting theory about what is actually happening behind the closed doors in Ankara. Dorothy is here to remind us why we should probably all be terrified of the current trajectory. Jacob Longman is joining us to find the silver lining, if one even exists anymore. And finally, we have Bernard Higglebottom, who has reported from the front lines of this relationship for 40 years. We are going to start with opening statements. Each of you has the floor to lay out your position on the state of Israel-Turkey relations. Herman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Korn. To understand where we are in March of 2026, we have to look past the fiery rhetoric of President Erdogan and look at the structural reality of the Turkish state. For a long time, analysts held on to the hope that the friction between Jerusalem and Ankara was merely a personality clash, a temporary fever brought on by the Justice and Development Party. However, the data now suggests a much more permanent shift. If you look at the recent Pew Research Center survey from 2025, 93% of the Turkish population views Israel negatively. This is no longer just a top-down ideological project. It has become socially and politically embedded. We are seeing what I call the institutionalization of hostility. Consider the events of February 2026. Turkey implemented new measures to block trade with Israel by suspending the Euromed certificates for Israel-bound products. This was done while Turkey was ostensibly participating in the Board of Peace Summit. From a technical standpoint, this is a sophisticated use of bureaucratic warfare. They are leveraging their position within the European Mediterranean trade framework to isolate Israel economically. We also have to look at the military and intelligence data. In February, Turkish authorities dismantled what they claimed was a Mossad-linked operative cell, arresting 2 people. This follows a pattern of heightened counterintelligence activity that treats Israel not as a difficult partner, but as a primary state adversary. While some point to the 1994 and 1996 defense cooperation agreements as a model for what could be, I argue those days are statistically irrelevant now. The military that signed those deals no longer exists. It has been purged and replaced by an officer corps loyal to the neo-Ottoman vision. Furthermore, we must address the financial flows. Israeli intelligence assessments suggest that hundreds of millions of dollars in Iran-directed cash are being routed through Turkish financial infrastructure to reach Hamas. Turkey has effectively become a sovereign laundromat for regional instability. When you combine this with the fact that the Turkish National Intelligence Agency, led by Ibrahim Kalin, is now the primary interlocutor for Hamas leadership, you see a country that has moved from being a mediator to being a participant. My position is that we are witnessing the permanent end of the secular, Western-oriented Turkish foreign policy. Whether Erdogan leaves in 2028 or not, the structural incentives for Turkey to lead the anti-Israel axis are now too strong to ignore. We are looking at a fundamental realignment where Turkey views its path to regional leadership as being paved over the delegitimization of the Israeli state.
A sobering start from Herman. Institutionalized hostility and a sovereign laundromat for terror. Raz, I suspect you see a different set of gears turning behind the scenes. What is your take on the Turkey-Israel dynamic?
Korn, Herman is looking at the scoreboard, but he is missing the guys who are actually betting on the game. Everyone wants to talk about the 93% disapproval rating and the trade bans, but let us follow the money into the dark corners where it actually moves. Isn't it convenient that while Erdogan is screaming about genocide and comparing Netanyahu to Hitler, there were 456 Turkish ships docking in Israeli ports in the first 9 months of 2025? 456, that is not a leak in the bucket, Korn. That is a deliberate, state-sanctioned bypass. What we are seeing is a massive piece of political theater designed to keep the masses angry, while the elites on both sides keep the engines of capital humming. But why the theater? That is the real question. I believe Turkey is being positioned as the controlled opposition for the entire region. Think about it. If you are the global powers, you need a way to manage the radical elements of the Middle East without letting Iran take total control. Turkey is the perfect vessel. By harboring the Hamas political bureau in Istanbul, Turkey gives the West a backdoor to the organization that they can claim they aren't using. It is a shell game. Erdogan gets to play the Sultan of the street, the hero of the Muslim world, which prevents a more radical, less predictable group from taking power in Turkey. Meanwhile, the trade continues through third-party routing and front companies. Notice how the trade ban expanded right after Netanyahu recognized the Armenian genocide in August of 2025? That wasn't about human rights. It was a choreographed exchange of blows to justify the next phase of the plan. And let us talk about Ibrahim Kalin and Hakan Fidan. These guys are intelligence masters. They aren't just talking to Hamas for the sake of peace. They are building a digital and financial shadow network that links Ankara, Tehran, and Doha. The real goal here isn't the destruction of Israel. It is the creation of a new regional clearinghouse where Turkey sits in the middle, taking a cut of every deal, every conflict, and every reconstruction contract. They want to be the gatekeepers of the Levant. The Ottoman shadow isn't a ghost, Korn. It is a blueprint for a corporate takeover of the Middle East. And the anti-Israel rhetoric is the marketing campaign that keeps the customers from looking at the fine print. They want us focused on the ships being blocked so we don't see the pipelines being built. They are playing both sides of the fence because the fence itself is a profit center.
So it is all a choreographed shell game to manage the radical elements while the elites get rich. Interesting. Dorothy, you usually have a less cynical and more apocalyptic view. How does this look from your perspective?
Korn, I wish I could believe it was just a shell game for profit. If it were only about money, we could negotiate. We could buy our way out of this. But what I see is far more dangerous. We are watching the reconstruction of a regional empire that views the existence of a sovereign Jewish state as a historical anomaly that must be corrected. Mark my words, the rhetoric we are hearing from Ankara is not for show. When Erdogan calls for the destruction of Zionist Israel, as he did in March of 2025, he is signaling a long-term strategic intent. We have seen this before. This is exactly how the regional environment shifted in the lead-up to the major conflicts of the 20th century. The most terrifying development is not the trade ban or the rhetoric, it is the geography. Look at the Syria wildcard. Since late 2024, Turkey has been aggressively expanding its footprint in post-Assad Syria. They are building a permanent buffer zone. They are installing loyalist administrations. For the first time in over a century, a hostile neo-Ottoman Turkey has a direct territorial dimension on Israel's northern border. We are no longer separated by a weak Syrian state. We are now face to face with a North Atlantic Treaty Organization member that harbors our most lethal enemies. And let us talk about the arrest warrants. In November of 2025, Turkey issued arrest warrants for Prime Minister Netanyahu and other senior officials for genocide. This is not just a diplomatic insult. It is a legal framework for the total delegitimization of the State of Israel. They are setting the stage to treat Israeli leaders as international pariahs, effectively trying to do through the courts what they cannot yet do through the military. And do not be fooled by the 2028 expiration of Erdogan's term. The alternative, the Republican People's Party, led by Ekrem İmamoğlu, might be more secular, but they are still riding the wave of that 93% negative sentiment Herman mentioned. There is no pro-Israel faction left in Turkey. We are seeing a society being mobilized for a generational struggle. Israel is being boxed in. To the south, you have the Iranian proxies. To the north, you now have a Turkish military that is the second largest in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, increasingly acting like a regional hegemon with a religious mission. This is the end of the post-1948 order. We are entering a period of extreme peril where a single miscalculation on the border or another Mavi Marmara-style incident could ignite a war between two of the most powerful militaries in the region. People are not taking this seriously enough. They think that trade will save us. History shows that trade is the first thing that dies when the drums of war start beating.
A dark outlook as always, Dorothy. Geography and ideology converging into a perfect storm. Jacob, you are the one who usually finds a reason to keep the lights on. Is there any hope in this relationship, or are we just waiting for the explosion?
Corn, I know it seems dire when you listen to Herman's statistics and Dorothy's warnings, but here is the thing. History is not a straight line toward a cliff. It is a series of cycles, and we have been at this low point before. Let us look at the actual behavior, not just the words. Raz touched on it, but I want to frame it differently. The fact that 456 ships sailed to Israel despite a formal ban tells us something beautiful about the human spirit and the power of mutual interest. It tells us that the Turkish business community, the merchants, the shippers, and the ordinary people who rely on this $7 billion trade relationship are quietly resisting the political madness. There is a massive gap between state-level posturing and economic reality. That gap is where hope lives. Look at the 2024 local elections. The opposition won major cities. People are tired of the hyperinflation and the isolation. They want to be part of the global community. Even if the current sentiment is negative, sentiment can change overnight with the right leadership. And speaking of leadership, let us look at Ekrem İmamoğlu. Yes, he has to play to the domestic crowd right now, but he represents a younger, more forward-looking Turkey that wants European integration and economic stability. You don't get those things by being a pariah state that harbors terrorists. Turkey's geographic position, which Dorothy sees as a threat, I see as a tether. Turkey is tied to the West through the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. They are tied to the global economy. They cannot simply sail off into the sunset of neo-Ottomanism without sinking their own ship. Also, let us not forget the historical precedent of the 1990s. We went from decades of cool relations to a golden age of joint air exercises and intelligence sharing almost overnight because the strategic interests aligned. Those interests still exist. Both Israel and Turkey are concerned about a nuclear Iran. Both want a stable Mediterranean. Both are energy hubs. The fundamentals of the relationship are still there, buried under a layer of populist rhetoric. Even the recognition of the Armenian genocide, which caused such a stir, is a hurdle we can move past. Diplomacy is about managing these peaks and valleys. I believe that once the current electoral cycle in Turkey plays out and the economic reality of their isolation sets in, we will see a pragmatic pivot. The Board of Peace might be a bit of a hypocritical start, but the fact that they even want to be on a board with that name suggests they know they need a way back to the table. We should be looking for the small openings, the back-channel talks in Istanbul, and the continued flow of goods as signs that the bridge hasn't been burned. It is just under maintenance.
The eternal optimist. The bridge is under maintenance, not burned. Bernard, you have been watching this bridge for a long time. You have seen it built, you have seen it bombed, and you have seen it rebuilt. What is the reality on the ground?
Corn, I have covered 5 of these ruptures and they always follow a similar script, but I have to agree with Dorothy on one point. This one feels heavier. I was in Ankara in 1996 when the military deals were signed. I saw the Israeli pilots training in Turkish skies. That wasn't just a political agreement, it was a deep structural alliance between two secular military establishments that shared a common worldview. That world is gone. I have also walked the docks in Mersin and watched those ships Raz mentioned. The reality is that the trade is leaking because the Turkish economy is in such bad shape that they literally cannot afford to stop selling to Israel. It is not out of the goodness of their hearts or a secret desire for peace. It is pure, desperate survival. But don't mistake that economic necessity for political warming. I've interviewed Hakan Fidan several times over the years. This is a man who is a true believer in Turkey's role as the leader of the Islamic world. When he meets with Hamas delegations, he isn't just acting as a mediator, he is acting as a patron. The meeting in December of 2025 wasn't about a ceasefire. It was about ensuring Hamas survives as a political entity that Turkey can use as leverage. The most important thing for your listeners to understand is the change in the Turkish bureaucracy. The grizzled old diplomats who used to value the relationship with Jerusalem have been sidelined. The new guard, the people around Ibrahim Kalin, see Israel as a tactical obstacle to their neo-Ottoman ambitions. They want to be the ones who manage Jerusalem. They want to be the protectors of Al-Aqsa. That is a role that is fundamentally at odds with Israeli sovereignty. I also want to mention the Armenian genocide recognition. I was in Jerusalem when that happened in August of 2025. It was a deliberate provocation by Netanyahu. He knew exactly which button he was pushing. It was a signal that Israel is done playing the game of pretending Turkey is a friend. When you have Naftali Bennett publicly calling Turkey a direct threat and part of a hostile regional axis, you are seeing a mirror image of the rhetoric in Ankara. Both sides have decided that the other is a primary adversary. The enforcement gap in the trade ban is closing too. The new measures in February of 2026 show that Erdogan is willing to hurt his own merchants to prove a political point. As for what happens after Erdogan in 2028, don't hold your breath for a return to the 1990s. Even the secular opposition in Turkey has moved toward a more nationalist, pro-Palestinian stance to keep up with public opinion. The reality on the ground is that the two countries are drifting into a state of Cold War. They will continue to trade where they must, they will talk when they have to, but the trust is completely evaporated. We are looking at a relationship that is now defined by managed hostility rather than strategic cooperation. The Ottoman shadow is long, and right now it is covering the entire map.
Managed hostility and an evaporated trust. Well, that completes our opening statements. We have a lot to chew on here. From Herman's data on institutionalized hatred to Raz's theory of a managed theater for the elites, Dorothy sees an empire rising on the border, while Jacob still sees the tether of economic reality. And Bernard, you grounded us in the reality of a broken bureaucracy and a desperate economy. This is a fascinating and terrifying range of perspectives. I have a lot of follow-up questions. I want to dig into the Hamas safe harbor problem, the actual impact of those trade bans, and what the Syrian buffer zone really means for Israeli security. We are going to take a quick break, and when we come back for round 2, I want each of you to respond to what you have heard. We are going to see if Jacob's silver lining can survive Dorothy's doom, and if Herman's data can account for Raz's shadow networks. Stay tuned. This is My Weird Prompts, and we will be right back. Alright, now that we have heard from everyone, it is time for round 2. I have some follow-up questions, and I want each of you to respond to what you have heard from the others. Let us get into it. Herman, Raz, and Jacob both pointed to the continued flow of goods and those 456 ships as evidence that the hostility is more performance than policy, if the economic ties are still there. Isn't your data on institutionalized hatred just a surface-level distraction from the real business being done?
Well, Korn, I think Raz and Jacob are falling into a classic analytical trap where they look at trade volume without looking at trade composition or the technical mechanisms of the current restrictions. While Raz is correct that ships are moving, he is missing the massive shift in the data regarding the cost of doing business. If you look at the January 2026 report from the Mediterranean Export Associations, you will see that direct trade between Turkish and Israeli ports has actually plummeted by 48% compared to the same period in 2024. What Raz calls a shell game, I call a massive economic decoupling. Those ships he mentioned are increasingly carrying low-value commodities or are engaged in complex re-exporting through third-party hubs like the port of Piraeus in Greece or Constanta in Romania. This adds a 15 to 20% premium on every transaction. In the world of global trade, a 20% tariff equivalent is not theater. It is a death sentence for long-term partnership. I also have to push back on Jacob's optimism regarding the Turkish opposition. Jacob, I've been looking at the policy papers coming out of the Republican People's Party research centers this year. Even if Ekrem Imamoglu takes power in 2028, he is inheriting a bureaucracy that has been fundamentally reshaped. The technical experts who used to manage the Israel desk at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs have been replaced by cadres who are ideologically committed to the Blue Homeland Doctrine. This is the neo-Ottoman maritime strategy that Dorothy was hinting at. It is not just an Erdogan project anymore, it has become a core pillar of Turkish national security identity. The data from the 2025 Turkish National Security Council briefings shows that they now categorize Israel's natural gas ambitions in the East Mediterranean as a direct threat to Turkish sovereignty. You cannot simply flip a switch and go back to the 1990s when your entire maritime strategy is predicated on blocking your neighbor's access to European markets. Furthermore, we need to address what Bernard said about the desperation of the Turkish economy. He is right that they need the money, but he is underestimating how the Turkish state is now using that economic desperation as a tool of leverage. They are not just selling goods. They are using their financial systems to facilitate what the United States Treasury Department recently flagged as the Istanbul-Tehran-Gaza corridor. My research into the 2025 financial audit of the Turkish state banks shows a massive increase in unclassified capital transfers that coincide exactly with the periods of heightened Hamas activity. We are talking about a sophisticated state-sanctioned financial architecture designed to bypass the traditional banking system. This is not a bridge under maintenance, as Jacob suggests. This is a fortress being built. When you combine the legal delegitimization Dorothy mentioned with the bureaucratic warfare of the trade bans, you see a country that is not looking for a way back to the table. They are looking to build a new table where they are the ones who decide who gets to eat. The research is clear. The structural incentives for hostility now far outweigh the dwindling profits of a broken trade relationship. We are witnessing the birth of a permanent regional adversary.
Roz, Herman just argued that the trade drop of 48% is a death sentence for your shell game theory, and that we are seeing a permanent fortress being built. If the economic decoupling is that severe, how do you explain the elites still getting their cut?
Herman, I love your spreadsheets, I really do. But you are looking at the front door while the back door is wide open. That 48% drop you cited? That is on paper, Herman. That is the official customs data. What it doesn't show is the massive surge in so-called humanitarian shipments to northern Cyprus that somehow find their way into the Israeli port of Haifa 48 hours later. It doesn't show the logistics consulting fees being paid to Turkish firms by Israeli tech companies through banks in Dubai and Singapore. The elites aren't losing money, they are just paying a complexity tax to keep the theater running for the masses. And let us be honest about the Sunni pole. Erdogan doesn't want to destroy Israel because that would remove his best prop. He needs Israel as the villain so he can keep the title of the only leader brave enough to stand up to the Zionists. It is a brand, Korn, a very profitable brand. Think about the reconstruction of Gaza. Who do you think is going to get those contracts? It won't be the Israelis, and it won't be the Iranians. It will be Turkish construction firms funded by Qatari capital, with the silent blessing of the West because they are the only ones who can talk to all sides. This isn't a fortress, it is a toll booth. Turkey is positioning itself as the middleman for the next 50 years of regional instability. They harbor Hamas because it gives them a seat at the table with the United States and Israel. If they didn't have Hamas in Istanbul, they would just be another struggling economy in the Mediterranean. By being the quartermaster for the resistance, they make themselves indispensable. Herman talks about the Blue Homeland Doctrine as a threat, but I see it as a bargaining chip. They are staking a claim so they can eventually trade it for a piece of the gas pie. It is all leverage. Everything is for sale in Ankara. You just have to know which currency they are accepting this week.
Dorothy, Jacob called the current crisis a bridge under maintenance and suggested that shared strategic interests, like the threat of a nuclear Iran, would eventually force a pragmatic pivot. He seems to think the fundamentals of the relationship are still there, just buried under populist noise. Why do you believe those shared interests are no longer enough to prevent the collision you are predicting?
Jacob, your optimism is not just misplaced, it is a sedative that prevents us from seeing the fire in the basement. You talk about a bridge under maintenance, but I am telling you the bridge has been rigged with explosives and the fuse is already lit. You suggest that a shared fear of Iran will bring Ankara back to the table. But that is a 1990s mindset applied to a 2026 reality. Turkey no longer views Iran as a simple existential threat to be balanced by an alliance with Israel. Under the neo-Ottoman vision, Iran is a rival to be outmaneuvered or a temporary partner in the dismantling of the Western order in the Levant. They are not looking for a protector in Jerusalem anymore. They are looking to replace the protector. And Raz, your theory about a shell game for the elites is equally dangerous because it ignores the power of ideology. You think the 456 ships represent a secret handshake between businessmen? I see them as the last few drops of water before the dam bursts. History is littered with the corpses of elites who thought they could ride the tiger of religious populism only to be devoured by it. This is exactly how it started in the 1930s. People thought the economic ties between the great powers would prevent a total breakdown. But when the rhetoric of blood and soil takes over, the spreadsheets in Herman's office become irrelevant. Once you mobilize 93% of a population to hate a neighbour, you cannot just turn that off because a shipping magnate in Istanbul wants to protect his margins. We need to look at what is happening on the ground right now. In February of 2026, Turkey did not just move some papers around. They conducted massive joint naval exercises in the eastern Mediterranean that specifically simulated the interdiction of offshore energy infrastructure. That is not a message for Tehran. That is a direct threat to Israeli gas rigs. Bernard is right that the old guard of secular diplomats is gone. But we must also acknowledge the terrifying speed at which the Turkish defense industry has become self-sufficient. In the 1990s, they needed Israeli avionics for their fighter jets. Today, they are exporting their own drones to half the world. They don't need us anymore, Jacob, and that makes them infinitely more dangerous. When you combine a self-sufficient military with a messianic vision of regional leadership, you don't get a bridge under maintenance. You get a collision course.
Jacob, Dorothy just described your worldview as a sedative and argued that the bridge between these two nations isn't under maintenance, but is actually rigged with explosives. Given Herman's data about a 48% trade collapse and the rise of this Istanbul-Tehran-Gaza corridor, aren't you just ignoring the very real structural walls being built right in front of us?
Corn, I'm not ignoring the walls. I'm just looking at who is building them and why. Dorothy mentions the 93% negative sentiment, but we have to ask how deep that sentiment really goes. It is a mile wide and an inch deep, driven by state-controlled media. If the economic situation in Turkey continues to deteriorate, and it will, the government will need a scapegoat, but they will also need a lifeline. We have seen this movie before. In 2021 and 2022, Turkey was at odds with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. The rhetoric was just as poisonous as what we are hearing now. And then, almost overnight, the pragmatism of the checkbook won out. Erdogan flew to Riyadh, he flew to Abu Dhabi, and the hostility was memory hold. Why? Because Turkey needed the investment. The same thing will happen with Israel. And we have to look at the Azerbaijan factor. As we discussed in episode 1133, Israel's alliance with Baku is a massive strategic counterweight. Turkey knows that if they push too hard against Israel, they risk complicating their own relationship with their most important ethnic ally. Azerbaijan relies on Israeli military technology and intelligence. That creates a natural ceiling for how far Ankara can go. There are checks and balances here that Dorothy is ignoring because they don't fit the apocalyptic narrative. The world is not just Turkey and Israel in a vacuum, it is a web of dependencies. Even the recognition of the Armenian genocide, which was a massive blow to the relationship in 2025, is something that can be managed. Diplomacy is the art of working with people you don't like to prevent things you can't afford. Turkey cannot afford a total break with the West, and they cannot afford to be completely isolated in the Mediterranean. The Board of Peace might be hypocritical, but it is an admission that they want to be part of the diplomatic architecture. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I am saying that the economic and strategic gravity will eventually pull these two back together, even if they are screaming at each other the whole way.
Bernard, Raz claims those 456 ships are proof of the secret handshake between elites, while Dorothy insists we are looking at a neo-Ottoman military expansion in Syria that makes trade irrelevant. You have been on the docks in Mersin and on the border in the Golan Heights. Is this just a profitable theater for the guys at the top, or are we actually watching the mobilization for a regional war?
Listen, Korn. I have spent 40 years chasing stories from the back of dusty Land Rovers in the Bakaya Valley to the polished marble halls of the Kankaya Mansion. Raz, I appreciate the cynicism, I really do. It makes for great late-night radio. But those 456 ships are not part of some grand, choreographed master plan. They are a symptom of a fever. Turkey's inflation is sitting at over 60%, and their foreign reserves are a joke. When your house is on fire, you do not stop the guy selling you a bucket of water just because you do not like his religion. That is not a shell game, that is a survival instinct. But do not mistake an economic transaction for a strategic alliance. Dorothy is much closer to the mark, though I think she is looking for a conventional war that is not coming. I was in northern Syria last October near the Turkish border. I saw the schools and the hospitals Turkey is building. They are not just a military occupier, they are an administrator. They are building a new reality where Turkey is the sovereign power in the Levant. This isn't about a quick military strike, it's about a slow, grinding displacement of the post-World War II order. The most dangerous thing I've seen lately isn't a ship or a tank, it's the textbooks. I've looked at the new curriculum being introduced in Turkish schools. It doesn't just criticize Israel, it erases the legitimacy of the Jewish state in a historical context. That is what Herman means by institutionalization. You are raising a generation to believe that the 1990s were a mistake and that the future belongs to a restored caliphate or a neo-Ottoman sphere of influence. The enforcement gap in the trade ban is closing because Erdogan has realized that the political gain of being the leader of the anti-Israel axis is worth more than the $7 billion in trade. He is willing to cannibalize his own merchant class to secure his legacy. As for the post-Erdogan era in 2028, we have to be realistic. Even the secular opposition has moved toward a more nationalist, pro-Palestinian stance to keep up with public opinion. The trust is gone, Korn. It didn't just evaporate, it was poisoned. We are looking at a relationship that is now defined by managed hostility. They will talk when they have to, they will trade where they must, but the days of joint air exercises and strategic partnership are buried in the 20th century. The Ottoman shadow is long, and right now, it is covering the entire map.
That brings us to the end of a truly heavy discussion here on episode 1124. We have covered a lot of ground today, from Herman Poppleberry's data on the 48% trade collapse and the institutionalization of hostility, to Raz's theory that this is all a choreographed toll booth for the regional elites. Dorothy has warned us of a neo-Ottoman empire rising on our northern border, while Jacob has reminded us that the economic gravity and the Azerbaijan connection might still provide a tether to reality. And Bernard, you have given us the perspective as someone who has seen the cycles of history and fears that this time the cycle has truly broken. The paradox of the Israel-Turkey relationship remains. It is a relationship where ships still dock while arrest warrants are issued. It is a relationship where a North Atlantic Treaty Organization member acts as the quartermaster for a group committed to the destruction of another regional power. Whether this is a temporary fever or a permanent realignment, the stakes for the Middle East could not be higher. As we look toward the 2028 election horizon in Turkey, the question remains, is there a path back to pragmatism, or are we witnessing the birth of a generational conflict? Thank you to my panel, Herman, Raz, Dorothy, Jacob, and Bernard, for your insights and your passion. And thank you, the listeners, for joining us on this deep dive. For the full archive of our discussions, including episode 1133 on the Israel-Azerbaijan alliance, please visit myweirdprompts.com. We will be back next week to tackle another piece of this global puzzle. Until then, keep asking the weird questions. This is Korn, signing off.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts.